At 8 o'clock the next morning, the cow arrived. Actually, it was half a cow. My parents bought this great big freezer. It had been delivered the week before. With the freezer, at no extra cost, they got a half cow butchered and wrapped in white paper packages with what part of the cow was written on the outside. For example, top round steak and rib roast. The writing was in black crayon. There were a lot of packages. It took two men half an hour to carry them all inside and take them down to the basement and stack them in the freezer. When my parents told my grandparents about buying the freezer and the half cow, my parents almost went wild. My grandfather my grandfather wanted to know if my father was going to have the head of the cow stuffed and mounted on a plaque and hung on the wall. I wondered if all the meat that made up our half cow actually came from one animal. If it did, it seemed to me that there might be a certain risk in buying so much meat all at once. I'm not sure if this is so, but it seemed to me that all things being equal, such things as what the cow was fed, age of cow, breed of cow, and so forth, some cows probably taste better than others. What would happen if you bought a whole half cow and then found out that it tasted lousy? What would happen if you went away on vacation and a fuse blew and the freezer went dead for 2 weeks? This actually did happen to us later, before we were even a quarter of the way through our half cow. Grandfather thought it was a big joke. Having a half cow's worth of beef in the freezer made me think more about the fact that all those white paper wrap packages had been a real live animal running around and enjoying itself. Before this, I had always thought of meat as something on a plate. I had been on a school trip to a farm once, and I remember that the cows had very nice eyes and tried to lick me with big slurpy tongues. I didn't like being licked, but there was no mistaking their good intentions. I'd always thought of cows as nice animals that give milk, and meat is something that your mother serves you. There hadn't been any connection before this. Watching the freezer fill up with meat made me realize that my grandparents at least had a point about being vegetarians, although I still couldn't understand why everything had to be raw. I had a toasted corn muffin and a cup of half milk, and half a coffee. My mother was watching the men carry the meat to the basement and checking off the number of parcels of each particular cut of meat on a checklist the freezer company had given her. I went out to catch the Hogborough bus. Aln Mndlshn had gotten on a few blocks earlier near his house. "How come you don't have to go to school?" he asked. I told him that Dr. Prince had given me an excuse for the rest of the week. "God, I wish they'd let me have a psychologist," Aln Mndlshn said. It was the same bus I always took to go see Dr. Prince. It went right past Bat Masterson Junior High School. Alan and I punched each other as we rolled past the school. It felt good to be off on an adventure when all the other kids were listening to Mr. Winter on the loudspeaker. Alan was particularly friendly. He didn't say anything about it, but I suspect he had had a boring time the day before, when he was the only kid out of school and not sick. The bus ride took about a half hour. We pulled into Hogborough bus terminal. The first thing we did was look in the window of the tattoo place near the bus station. There were big sheets of paper and copies of tattoos you could get. We discussed getting tattooed, but neither of us could find anything we absolutely would like to have on our skin. The best one was Donald Duck, and the word mother written underneath. We decided to give it some more thought. We walked uptown along Clark Street. We had looked in the Hogborough Yellow Pages, and there were a lot of bookstores on Clark Street. I had about $15, and Alan had about the same. After a few blocks, we saw 4 or 5 bookstores clustered together in the middle of the block. The biggest one had a vertical sign as tall as the building. "Books," it said in red block letters. We went in. The bookstore had a funny smell. Not bad, just funny. It was sort of a dry smell, like oatmeal before you cook it. There were bookshelves all the way to the ceiling, which was high, and tables piled with books, and books in stacks tied together with a string, and a flight of stairs going up, with big red arrow pointing straight up. On the arrow was a sign: "More books upstairs, comics and periodicals, 3rd floor." We went up. The 3rd floor was all magazines and comics. There were big tables covered with comics standing upright in long rows. A sign hanging from the ceiling said, "All comics 5 cents." We began flipping through the comics. Alan had a list with the titles and numbers of the comics he wanted. It was slow work. The only comic he found that was on his list of wants was a copy of Action Comics #1, but he didn't buy it because there was a corner torn off. Torn off the cover. He said he only bought comics that were perfect. I figured that there were about 1.5 million comics in that place, and Alan and I went through about half of those. I was getting sort of bored. I was happy when Alan said he'd had enough of the place, and why didn't we try someplace else? He gathered together a stack of about 50 comics that he might possibly consider buying if nothing more interesting turned up. He put them all together under a table, so no one else would be able to buy them until he could make up his mind. We went downstairs and outside into the street. It seemed very noisy and lively in the street after the quiet of the bookstore.